scripture reading will be taken from 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4. First of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth.
As was just read for us a moment ago, we need to be in prayer for our country, and in particular for those who lead our land. Whether that's people who are leading our country right now or those who are going to be leading our country in the future. They need our prayers, but that's not even so much our primary focus today, even though they need our prayers. We're going to be discussing from what was read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. The reality is we need our prayers that we make for them. There are 4 reasons that we're told in 1 Timothy 2 that we need to be praying for our leaders. It's so that we will actually benefit from this, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life with all godliness and reverence. We're going to be going through these 4 reasons piece by piece in 1 Timothy 2, and I want to illustrate both of these from the Bible. We're going to do a comparison and a contrast. What's it like when you have peace, quietness, when you have godliness and reverence, and then what's it like when you have all the opposite of these things working in society? We're going to look at this from the Bible, and we're also going to have some discussions from what we have in our current state in our country today. So the first of these 4, our leaders need prayer. We need the prayers that we are offering for our leaders because it helps us to lead a peaceful life. When we open to Acts, the 9th chapter, we discover very quickly that the Christians weren't getting to lead a peaceful existence. There's a man who's very powerful in the Jewish government. His name is Saul. Now, there is dispute as to whether he was a governmental official or just very influential to governmental officials. But one thing's for sure, he is a power player in the Jewish government. And he's using his power to wreak havoc among the Christians, to interrupt the peace that they could be enjoying in everyday life. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. He's threatening the disciples, but he's doing more than that. He's arresting them. He's having them beaten. The word that's used, breathing murder, you look back in the 7th chapter of Acts, he's been an instrumental part in the murder of one Christian already. And we find in chapter 9 that this just continues. So, this is some serious persecution against the Christians. He's interrupting their daily lives and messing up even their livelihoods. Their economics is what he's interfering with. Now, thankfully, I don't know of a single case that I can point out to you in the United States today where our government is threatening the life. Whether we live or die because we're serving Jesus as Christians. But I can point out a number of instances in which our liberties and potentially our freedom is being threatened, and most certainly where our everyday lives and livelihoods are. I'm going to give you an instance that actually goes back a little bit more than a decade. Hard to believe that 2013, that was that long ago, but just a little bit more than a decade. And there was a couple, the Kleins seemed to be very nice folks, Melissa and Aaron, and they had the small business in the state of Oregon, Sweet Cakes. Nice name. Sweet Cakes. As you might be able to tell by the image, they were baking cakes for people. A lot of times they would do it for weddings, probably also birthday parties, anniversaries, and other events. But there was a couple that came in and requested for their wedding cake to be made. And this isn't, their norm as far as the wedding cakes would go. These were 2 ladies who were together and they were about to get married, 2013. and they requested for this cake to be made. And they very politely declined to make that cake. And they said, see, the reason for that is we're Christians, and we don't believe that two people of the same gender should be getting married, and so we would decline to do that. But, thank you for asking. Well, they were very offended by that. And you could understand from their point of view, especially if they'd never heard that. So one of these young ladies goes home and tells her mom what just happened. Her mom was infuriated. And so then, shortly thereafter, she makes a return trip to the store, her first one, and she says, hey, look, my daughter and her girlfriend came in here, and they wanted a wedding cake, and you declined to make that. I said, well, yeah, on the basis of our religion, we don't. And she tried to talk some sense into them. She said, well, listen, I understand. I used to have the same kind of viewpoints, but then her daughter, and they'd morphed over time, and maybe she thought she was going to change their minds. Well, Aaron quoted to her a Bible verse, stating why, for their religion, they couldn't do that. This lady then drummed up a lawsuit against them. They were sued for $135,000 for the damages, the punitive damages that had been created for these two young ladies. And an Oregon court ruled in the two ladies' favor, and so they had to pay $135,000. But, there's an appeal process. Went to an appellate court in Oregon, lost. Appealed it a second time in Oregon, lost again. And so this just kept moving up the ranks until 6 years later, 2019, it finally made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed the decision, ruled in the couple's favor, and, I don't claim to be super privy on how all this legal stuff works, but some part of it, apparently, they sent back down to the Oregon courts, and then the Oregon courts decided, well, that $135,000 was excessive, so you only have to pay $30,000 now for what you've done toward this couple. The Kleins had to close down their shop. They moved states. They now live, last I heard anyway, in the state of Montana. And they've opened up a cake shop in that place, and they're continuing on. But the point of which is this: don't think that just because we live in the United States of America, well, there's no way that I can be attacked by anyone or the government would stand by and to let this happen. It's happened before, and unfortunately, it probably isn't going to be the last time that it occurs. There's persecution in the 9th chapter of Acts is going on with the Christians, the worst of which is people losing their lives and being hurt and thrown into prison simply because they're living for Jesus, but left and right, their livelihoods are being interrupted. So the powers that be needed the prayers of the Christians. You look in the book of Acts, and the church was a praying group. You have in the 3rd chapter, they go up to the temple at the hour of prayer. Chapter 4, they all pray together in a house, and the foundations of where they're standing, or kneeling perhaps at that moment, were shaken. Chapter 12, you have the persecution of Peter. He's about to be executed. The church is together praying, and God sends an angel and releases him from prison. Acts 27, the awful shipwreck that, it was doomed, it seems that from the beginning, as Paul stated. But there's prayer, and all the lives are spared on board. The church of the New Testament is a praying church, and things happen. They're praying for their leaders, and they're praying for peace when they're being tormented. And there are periods that God grants their requests and gives them some reprieve. This man meets Jesus on the road to Damascus as he's going to kill more of his servants. And Jesus reveals himself to him. He sends his servant Ananias to him. Saul is so sorry, and he wants to serve Jesus now with the rest of his life. And we find in verses 20 and 21, immediately he goes into the synagogues of the place. He had gone here to arrest Christians, but now he goes into these synagogues not to arrest Christians, but to proclaim the man whom he was persecuting. And they're all amazed and said, is this not the one who destroyed those, who called on this name in Jerusalem? He's come here for that purpose, so that he might bring them bound to the chief priest. Prayer has changed things. It's transformed this Jewish influencer, if not this Jewish leader's hearts. And he's become a Christian. And now, that has made him public enemy number one. When we have leaders who are seeking out our good, Now, don't misunderstand. We need to pray for all of our leaders. And we want changed hearts and we want changed conditions in our society. But we'd better say extra prayers for the ones who are standing up for the rights of God's people, because that puts a target on their backs. It certainly did Saul. Down in 23 and 24, now after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. Now his life is in danger because he's standing up for Christians. But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Listen, it's a dangerous job to be a public official in any place of the world at any point in time. And the higher you go, the more perilous it becomes. Just in fun, I had somebody ask me one time, a couple of kids, they said, "Would you ever be interested in being president of the United States?" You know, as if. And I said, "Absolutely not." Now, I say that. You're talking about my personal interest, -4. Okay, that's where my interest level is on a personal level. And there's a reason for that. Have you ever thought that as far as the leaders of our country go, you count up all the presidents, and all of those that we've had, 45 different individuals, nearly 1/10, it's not quite 1/10, Marty, so don't be saying, "No, it's not." I know. But it's really close. It's like 11.5, I think is what it is. But almost 1/10 of all the presidents we have had served have been assassinated while in office. That began with Abraham Lincoln, it continued with James Garfield, and then it progressed with William McKinley, and then, of course, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This is a side note, but have you ever heard about the curse of the 0 years of those who are elected? For more than right at 100 years, a little bit more than 100 years, those who were elected in years ending in 0 all died while they were in office. So this began, and now this isn't the year they died, but this is the year they were elected. 1860, Abraham Lincoln. James Garfield, 1880. William McKinley, 1900. And then these next two were peaceful. They weren't assassinations. But you have Warren Harding in 1920. And then FDR, 1940. JFK, 1960. And then who was next in 1980? That was Ronald Reagan. And he came within, I believe it was 1/4 of an inch of dying while he was in office from the assassination attempt on him. Now, we're not superstitious, but that is kind of strange, isn't it? Those who had gotten in were elected on years ending in 0 for 100 years, greater than 100 years, died in office. And then it was thought, well, President Reagan broke the curse, and so you don't have it anymore. In 2000 with Bush, and then going on from there. You know, I bring this up, though, the third guy from the left, James A. Garfield. I would have loved if he could have carried out a full term in office. He died within a year. He was assassinated. You know, he's the only church member to serve as a president of our country. I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with our land. And actually, prior to his becoming president, he was a preacher of the church. He was also an elder in the church. And he's actually quoted as saying that he was stepping down from the most important position in the world to serve as president of the United States. Think about that. That's true. It really is. There's no greater role than to be a shepherd of God's sheep. And he said, I'm going to step aside because I've been called for this unique opportunity just to be a president. Was killed within a year of being in office. I would say probably a guy who looked out for the Christians. A mention of course, there have been assassinations attempts. 3 have been wounded in assassination attempts of our presidents and have survived. It began with Theodore Roosevelt. He was out of office when that happened. Ronald Reagan, of course, was in office, and then most recently, a few months ago, on President Trump, also out of office. Listen, you couldn't pay me enough to want to be president. You have a target on your back, and that's true of wherever you are, but especially if you seek to stand up for, and I'm not saying any certain of these ones, I'm just saying, especially if you seek to stand up for Christians, it's never been a popular thing to do so. People are going to be looking to take you out. And there are some reasons for this. Look in chapter 9, verse 25. People are looking to take out this Jewish leader who's standing up for Christians. But the disciples intervene, and so does God. They took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket, the only way to get him out safely. But notice in verse 31, now that this guy's crossed over, prayer has changed things. This guy has been converted. He's standing up for now instead of persecuting God's people. And so the churches throughout all the area, Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, had peace, were edified, and they were multiplied. Life is good again. Prayers have been answered. Listen, we can change this country through the prayers that we offer up to God. As we were reminded in our study, there are a lot of concerns that we have in this nation. Our nation's very divided about the economy, about foreign policy, about immigration, about gun control. We could go on and on, all the things that divide us. But none of these things, one side or another, is what's going to make this country successful. One thing is, Psalm 33, verse 12. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. This nation has been extremely blessed, even to date, for 250 years, because this is a country that was founded upon a respect for, I would say, a passion for God. Pray that the God of heaven intervenes. And that when we have instances like we spoke of earlier, where we're not enjoying peace, pray for peace. Pray for our leaders to change their mindset. Those who are peaceable, those who seek the good of God's people, pray for them to stay in office. Do everything you can to help encourage that. There are things that we can do. Pray for our leaders so that we can have a quiet life. A quiet life is a nice life. I know there's, the fast pace and all the noise, and quiet's pretty good sometimes too. Here's the opposite of quiet. Acts 19, 23 through 27. About that time, there arose a great commotion about the way. In the book of Acts, that's what we call Christianity. So about Christianity, there's a big commotion societally going on about it. That's not usually a good thing for Christians. We like it to be a little bit quieter than that. There's this silversmith who is involved in making these silver shrines of this false goddess of the Romans and the Greeks, and you'll find a counterpart name for that. But Diana, and they brought no small profit to the craftsmen. In other words, these guys are making bank off of this pseudo-religion. And if you're very familiar with false religions of the Bible, and really false religions in general, they're often built upon immorality. There are all kinds of sexual perversions that are tied up in them, and these are the Romans and the Greeks are no exception to that. And it's understood very widely, and I hate to say it, but it's the truth, and you know it is, that sex sells. Always has, and it always will. And it sells back then also, and that's the business in which these guys are found. Well, he calls all of his business partners together, and he says, men, you know that we have made our prosperity by this trade. We are making bank with this false religion. Now, they don't see it as that probably, but this false religion and these sexual perversions that are attached to it. Moreover, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying they're not gods. And so not only is this trade of ours falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana. If you notice priority here, he doesn't say, our religion is being jeopardized first. He tosses that in somewhere along the way. First, he says, our economics are being threatened. I've always said, you want to hit someone where it hurts, you hit them in the pocketbook, and they'll notice pretty quickly. Their pocketbooks are potentially being hit. Okay, so that's what's going on in the first century. 21st century in America. Is there any conflict of interest between Christianity and money-making agencies? Isn't it strange when religion is persecuted? It's almost always Christianity that's at the heart of it. That's the case back here. About all the other religions were tolerated. Christianity, that's the one we have to stamp out today around the world. What's the most persecuted religion in existence? You don't see a lot of persecution of Islam. You do probably more of Judaism than you do other religions, far and away, not even close in numbers. Christianity is what continues to be attacked. Why is that the case? I believe it's because of its uniqueness in morality. Its code of ethics stamps out so much sin that brings a lot of money to nations and to the world. And in particular, sexual perversion. You have any idea what Hollywood and what music artists make in a year? You ever listen to really concentrate? I know we like, rhythms and melodies and beats. You ever concentrated a whole lot, though, on what the words are? Typically, the most popular songs are filled with sexual perversion, drug abuse, demeaning of women, perverted things even toward children. And if you don't believe me, just look back a few years into our nation's history. Jeffrey Epstein, at the time, I believe at the time of his passing, he was still worth $550 million. The prolific sex trafficker had the private island with all the sexual perversions that were taking place, and many of our top politicians, music artists, actors, and actresses were traveling back and forth. We have record of it through plane flights to this island. $550 million. A little more recently, Sean P. Diddy Combs. Now, I'm going to be fair to the guy and say this. The trial hasn't happened yet. It's scheduled for May. But I will also go out on a limb and say there's a reason why he's not going to be set free until the trial is over. There is a lot of incriminating evidence. This was the big guy on the scene. In the late 90s, back in my prime, back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the hip-hop artist. And now it appears, hopefully it's all wrong. I hope it is. But now it appears there's a lot of sexual perversion in which he was tied up in sex trafficking. Value, net worth, $900 million. Almost a billionaire. Do you think there isn't money in sexual perversion and the exploitation of women and children? What about the practice of abortion in our country? Since its inception, we've averaged about 1 million, I think it's a little bit over, 1 million abortions in the United States per year. And you'll get different figures if you look up how much one of those costs. Easily, you're looking at $1,000. And I'm going to say probably 2, 3. Let's keep it conservative and say $1,000. Now, you take 1 million and you multiply that times 1,000. And you're at 1 billion. That's $1 billion industry. And if you'll notice, if you believe the statistics, at least a quarter of which our government has personal interest. You think that's not a money-making agency? Alcohol. Sale of alcohol alone. Now listen, this isn't the sales of alcohol. This is the revenue that comes in from the sales of alcohol over the last decade. Our government has consistently brought in $10 billion a year just in the taxation of alcohol. If you're wondering, well, why are there so many people in our government that are pushing for the legalization of another mind-altering drug recently with marijuana? The state of Washington bringing in over $500 million every year in taxation alone. The United States has just added about $6 billion per year in taxation of this mind-altering drug. You know what these all have in common relative to Christianity? Christianity, Christ, teaches against the abuse understood, not the use. God made everything inherently good, but the abuse of mind-altering drugs, of the murdering of children, the exploitation of women and children. And there are those who might not come out publicly and say, but many who behind closed doors are saying, we have to put a stop to this. This is threatening our livelihood. How are we going to be able to move on and make big money like we have? You understand why Christianity is such a threat to the power players and the money makers of the world? Chapter 19, 28 through 34. These people, when they heard this, our pocketbooks are going to be hit, they're full of wrath and cried out, great is Diana of the Ephesians, whether they believe it or not, because they're thinking, great is the almighty dollar, we want to be billionaires still. That's what they're thinking. So the whole city filled with confusion, rush into the theater, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions. Some cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused. Most of them didn't even know why they'd come together. But someone's angry and excited. Oh, yeah, we are too. And they just, go on to the lynching. Alexander then motioned to this big crowd. He wants to make his defense to the people. But with one voice, all in that place cried out for 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians! Great is Diana of the Ephesians!" It's quite a scene. Some of you have seen this, I think, in person. I would love to. This is the amphitheater of the Ephesians. This is the actual one. It's the ruins. I'm sure it's been built, back a little bit. But, this is the foundation of the old amphitheater of the Ephesians. It would house at least 25,000 to 30,000 people. Some estimates are as high as 56,000 individuals. This is essentially a football stadium of today as far as its capacity goes. And they're in here, and this is the great weapon of those who are living in sin. It's not loving, calm reason and conversation. It's wild, out-of-control passion is all that it is. Emotion, volatile emotion, and hatred. And they know if we can just stir up people to hate one another and not to be able to converse with each other, even when they disagree, but just to become violent against each other and to say, "You're wrong," and have no idea why you even believe what you do or why they believe what they do. They've won. But if the principles of Christianity prevail and we love one another, and even when we disagree, we can sit down and we can talk about things, and even if we don't agree at the end of it, we still walk away loving each other and proud to be fellow citizens of the same nation, then we, the people, have won. If we can have honest, rational conversations that are subjective and we're not just pouring out our feelings into it, that's when Christians win, and that's when citizens of a country, and for us, citizens of America, win. Well, that's what boisterous confusion looks like. If you're wondering, what does quietness look like? 35 through 41. The city clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, you ought to be quiet." You're too loud, too much commotion about Christians. "You ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. The courts are open, there are proconsuls. If you have any inquiry to make it in the determined lawful assembly." What they're saying is this: be cordial toward people. Don't be confused and just angrily shouting. Present a rational, legal argument. He's almost advocating Christianity there, isn't he? He says, "For today's uproar, there's no reason that we can give account for this disorderly gathering." And when he said this, he dismissed the assembly. And the uproar is gone. Now, which of these two kinds of life do you want? Do you want the one where people are angry and they're volatile, operating based off emotion and hatred, and there is this crazy mob mentality? Or do you want the kind of official who'll stand up and say, "We need to cut this nonsense out. Look, we can go have a rational conversation in a court if we need to, but let's handle this like human beings"? I'm going to say there's a reason this guy is only a city clerk, and he's not a governor, a king, or an emperor. You don't get to vote for a lot of people like that, right? Yeah, but this guy, I think he would make a great leader on a larger scale. We need leaders like that. People who care about others. People who can have open, honest conversations. Pray that we can have these kinds of people in the government. Because there's always going to be the group that are going to incite and stir up volatile emotion and try to mob mentality. I would argue in the United States we still have that. That's called the media. And in saying that, I'm not saying, hey, this side, I think it's both sides that do it. Just be open and honest with information. Sit down, have a conversation. Don't talk over one another. Let the other talk. I miss that in our country, don't you? We can have it again. Pray for our leaders and pray for one another that we have something better than what we do today. Pray for our leaders that we can lead a godly life. 6th chapter of Daniel, there's this super servant of the Lord. He's a prophet of God, and he's very influential. He's risen up the ranks in the government. those who are living wickedly, they don't like this, and they attack him. And they do so through his religion. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. The governors and the satraps throng before the king, and they say, "O King Darius, live forever." All the governors, the administrators, the satraps, counselors, advisors, everyone has come to a consensus. We've consulted together. We want you to make a firm decree that anyone who petitions any god or man except for you, O king, for 30 days will be cast into the den of lions. So all you have to do, sign the writing. It will not be changed. And tickling his ego, King Darius says, yeah, I'm kind of like a god, aren't I? He's a new king. He's getting used to this. And so he signs the writing. This poor guy, I don't think he realizes that he has legislated immorality. He has criminalized godliness. And oh, is there a push to criminalize godliness and to decriminalize ungodliness? We have it going on in our country, in our home state. And we think, well, we live in Missouri, so no, it's going on here too. We have a chance at the ballot box to look out for a major injustice that's seeking to be undone. Did you know that in the state of Missouri right now, it's essentially illegal to murder a baby? There is a provision that's built in for the life and health of a mother right now in the state of Missouri, but it's essentially illegal to murder a baby. On the ballot, we have an Amendment 3 that can be altered now, and so we can get back to, like the country had done for many decades, murdering children and not have to answer for that, or so we think. We can decriminalize ungodliness. Now, in Daniel's case, they're criminalizing godliness, but in this case, we have the chance to decriminalize ungodliness. We're in control of that. It's on us, whatever decision we make. Well, Daniel says, I don't care what the law says about what's godly. I'm going to continue to do what's godly, even if it's been criminalized. So he continues praying to God as he's always done. Well, he's caught doing that, and so the king has no choice. Verse 16, he gives the command. They bring Daniel, throw him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, I have confidence, Daniel, or maybe it's wishful thinking. Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. How sad when you have godly people standing up for innocence and trying to preserve people's lives, in the case of Daniel, being thrown to the lions. But thankfully, we live in the United States, and we don't have lion dens because we don't believe in cruel and unusual punishment. Well, not actual ones. But we do have people trying to do the right thing and to stand up for life who are being thrown to the lions left and right. Their reputations are being consumed. And we're hearing for those who are trying to stand up for innocent children's lives that they hate women, that they're against women's health, and they want women to die. Being thrown to the lions, all because they're trying to stand up for innocent babies' lives. Listen, I would never tell someone publicly for whom they should vote or even how they ought to vote on an amendment. It's not about that. It's not the place of the church. It's certainly not the place of me. But what I will proudly do is to proclaim our Lord and His principles and the things on which He tells us to stand. And I encourage you to take these and to place them alongside each candidate you're considering to vote for. And when you're trying to determine an amendment, should I vote yes or no? Maybe the retention of a Supreme Court justice, what decisions that have been made. Do it on that basis. It's not my role to tell you for whom or for what to vote. But it is to remind of Jesus and for what He stands. And because we're Christians and we follow Him, the things for which we stand as His people. Notice the difference prayer made. By the way, the last prayer that Daniel made before he was arrested, I wonder if he gave an utterance for King Darius. Listen to how this man changes through the experience. Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, languages, and all the earth, peace be to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God. His kingdom shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and Cyrus. So early on, you have godliness being criminalized, and then in the end, when this guy sees the power of God, you have him proclaiming godliness throughout his empire. That's how prayer can change things. In which type of nation do you want to live? Pray for our government so that we can lead a respectable existence. Joseph went to the land of Egypt. He's a slave when he enters in. Things are going very well for him, and he's accused of some awful thing that he didn't do. It involves his master's wife in chapter 39 of Genesis 19 and 20. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, "Your servant did to me after this manner," that his anger was aroused. Then his master took him and he put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. We can't have this happening. How awful it is. Can you imagine a nation getting to such a state so that it's taking its innocent, godly citizens and throwing them into prison while the criminals are out running around free? What are you supposed to do if you ever get to a spot where your nation's doing that? Surely we would never do that in our country, would we? Well, this isn't our country. It's our former one, though. I don't know if you saw the headline, but here recently, a United Kingdom judge sentenced a woman to 31 months, that's a little over 2.5 years, in prison for hate speech. She said something with which the government did not agree, and she was put into prison for more than 2.5 years. Meanwhile, that same judge tried a case involving a man who had control of sickening amounts, as if one piece isn't enough, ridiculous amounts of child pornography. It was clear that he was guilty, and it was understood that 0 months he assigned in prison to this man. 0 months for the exposure and taking advantage of children. 31 months for saying something with which the government did not agree. The innocent, law-abiding citizens, putting them in prison while allowing the criminals to run around freely. That wouldn't happen, though, in our country. 2015, June 26, the U.S. Supreme Court deemed that two people of the same gender have just as much right to marry as two heterosexual people, and all the same social rights and access and amenities as all the others. Well, in Rowan County, a couple months later, Rowan County, Kentucky, Kim Davis, with her name on marriage certificates, licenses, as she's issuing them, a same-sex couple came in to get married. Her name is found on that document, meaning she consents, she goes along with it. And she let these people kindly know, listen, I can't give this marriage certificate to you. It's in violation of my First Amendment rights and my religious beliefs. They ask her this question, on what grounds are you refusing to do this? This is your job. By what authority? She said, by God's authority. She refused to do it. The powers that be told her, hey, listen, you better do this or there are going to be consequences. She said, I can't. It's a violation of my conscience and my religion. My religion teaches this, and I can't go along with this. She and her county were sued for more than $250,000 by the ACLU. Listen to this. She was put in prison for 5 days. 5 days she spent behind bars. Now, as wild as this sounds, this is almost 10 years ago in America. You would think, well, maybe you could see this. No offense to the great states of. You might see this in California or Colorado or, Oregon, we're talking earlier, Washington, New York, New Jersey. You could maybe see that. This is in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. This happened. Criminalizing godliness, decriminalizing ungodliness, taking innocent, godly citizens and putting them behind bars, meanwhile allowing the evil people, the criminals, to run freely. It's something we have seen in our country before. It's something that took place with Joseph. God is with Joseph. He brings him out of it. Keep that in mind. Chapter 41, verses 38 through 40, Pharaoh says to his servants, wow, this guy who was a prisoner for maybe 12 years, he sees him in the prisons. Hey, this guy's doing great things. He helps out Pharaoh. Let's bring him out. And essentially he tells him, I'm putting you second in charge over the whole country. he doesn't have anyone like this among the free people. So he takes one of the criminals, who's an innocent, godly man, and puts him in power. What are we to do if our government ever gets to the point where we're criminalizing innocent, godly people, and the criminals are out running around freely? Well, might take a page out of Pharaoh's book in Egypt. You might consider trying to put the criminals into office. I hope it never gets to that point. I'm not saying I know all the background of everything that occurred. You remember in South Africa about 20, 30 years ago? There was a man most viewed as being unfairly imprisoned for, I believe it was 27 years, Nelson Mandela. And when he got out of prison, he ran for election. He won it. The criminal became leader, and it was a very popular figure, not only in his country, but as well around the world. Now, for a number of reasons, he's forever in the history books. What do we do? What hope is there for us? Listen, even when things get bad in the country, worst case scenario, trust in God to take care of his own people. We'll close on this, chapter 47, verse 13. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen. Listen to this. And they had possessions there, and grew, and multiplied exceedingly. I think you can make a case this is the toughest economic time maybe in the history of the Middle East. The people in Egypt, which was a very affluent, wealthy country, the people in Egypt were selling all of their livestock in an agricultural time, selling off all their land, and they're still just trying to scrape through to have enough food to eat for the next day. Meanwhile, you have God's people in the land of Goshen, just a little bit separated from them to the north, who they're not selling any of their land. They're not selling any of their herds. In fact, everything just increasing. It's like a great economy for them. We understand that things aren't great in the American economy right now. Trust in God to see you and your family through. I was having a conversation with a guy earlier this week. He's a fellow believer. And he said, my wife and I, we had a young family back in 2008. And we had an opportunity presented to us to go off on our own to start a new business. And we were excited to become entrepreneurs. And so we began this, he said, right after we got started. Anybody remember 2008? For those who were alive back then, that's a rough time. Stock market crash. The housing market went down the tank. Inflation associated with everything, high gas prices, you name it. It was just out of control. And he said, I spoke to my wife. What have we gotten ourselves into? He had no idea this was going to happen. Good people. Kept their trust in God, kept working hard, treated people the right way in their business. He said, we had some big company out of, I think it was St. Louis, call us. They're from the area. And had a big job, and he said it just continued. He said, you know, in that economy, when so many businesses, well-established, were closing their doors, we, a new business, we thrived in that economy. And he was telling me this not braggadociously. He was giving credit to God for what he had done for their family. No matter what's going on in our economy, keep your trust in God. No matter what happens a week from Tuesday, keep your trust in God. He's in control. No matter how things look for the future, how dire, keep your trust in God. He always takes care of his own. He always has taken care of you if you're serving him, and as you continue to serve him, he always will take care of you. There are big decisions personally and as a nation we have to make over the next 9 days. Not just on presidency, also for senators, for representatives, potential retention of justices, yeses and nos, on amendments. Research all those things with a view of the mind of Christ and what he wants us to do. Those are big decisions, but as big as they are, I assure you there's a much bigger decision that needs to be made today. I have a suspicion that there are some among us who have yet to make a decision on the eternal ballot. And you have two choices. You can either just vote for yourself. You know, that's kind of easy to do. You can vote for yourself. You can write in Mickey Mouse if you want. A lot of people do that for elections. Or you can cast your vote for Jesus. And not to be president of our country, but to be king. He's the perfect sovereign ruler and king over your life. In the second chapter of Acts, the people were told about how important Jesus is. He's Lord, He's Master, and He's the anointed one, or He's King. And when they heard this, they said, what do we need to do? And yes, to get the forgiveness of sins, but I believe in part it's what do we need to do to make Him ruler, King over us? And they're told you need to change your mind, the way you think. Stop voting the way you want to vote, you might say, in spirituality. Vote the way Jesus is and the way He lives. Start living like Him. Find your forgiveness in being baptized, and you will be added to the greatest nation that's ever been, the kingdom of heaven. Look, I know we get pretty worked up about politics, and there's some significant things to consider with that. There's health, there's life, there's freedom, as far as being Christians and the generations to come after it, and those are very important things. But big picture, those are only going to affect things for a few years. This ballot affects things for eternity. Whoever is president today, whoever is president, senator, or representative, or a judge or a justice tomorrow, whether the amendment is yes or it's no, this is the most important ballot that you will ever fill out. What's your vote for Jesus? Come, make Him King of your life as we stand and sing together.